Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of Project StuG. I know it's been a long time since episode 3, and many of my new subscribers won't have seen the rest of the series. If you haven't seen the previous episodes, do check them out, so you can get an idea of just how problematic scratch building can be. Unlike building a kit where someone else has researched the subject, worked out how to break it down into parts, and design it so you can put it together, scratch building poses a whole new set of problems. Project StuG isn't a shake and bake build. Let's start with research. Gathering as many decent books as possible is crucial, but nothing beats getting up close and personal with this subject in a museum. Unfortunately, right now that is a bit tricky, but things are getting better slowly. Once you've got all your research together, the next stage is working out how you're going to make the part. Here there are many choices: what material you're most comfortable with, what technology is available to you, and what skills you have. The great thing about scratch building is you get the opportunity to experiment with new materials and techniques and learn new skills. Making mistakes is all part of the process, so don't feel disheartened when it happens. Just learn from it and try again. The most annoying situation is when you've researched a part, had to make a few assumptions, spent ages making the part, and then 24 hours later discover some new information that contradicts what you've just created. As you can see from my projects, that frequently happens, but I do manage to get it right in the end. Okay, let's get back onto Project StuG. In this episode I'm going to recreate the MG34, the main defensive armament of the StuG 3G. Just for the sake of good housekeeping, I wanted to close the gunner's hatch while I was in the area. I'd already cast the hinges several months ago, but these were just rough castings and needed to be cleaned up and fitted together so they actually functioned. I hate making multiple parts of fiddly bits, but once I got into the zone, it all went quite quickly and I ended up with 4 sets of working hinges. The hatch doors were carefully cut from 0.7mm brass sheet. Holes were drilled in the hatches to align and retain the hinges. Additional holes are to fit the dummy hinge bolts, which fit on the inside. I still have to research and make the latch mechanism before I finally glue the hinges to the fighting compartment, but I'm really pleased with the fit of the closed hatches. It took me about a day to complete the hinges and hatch, but taking things slow and steady paid off in the end. Now, let's get on to the main event. The MG34 entered production back in 1934 and was widely used by the German army, with over 500,000 being made by the end of the war. It was often mounted on a bipod for infantry use, but other mounting systems were available. It could be belt-fed or carry single or twin drum magazines. So successful was the MG34 that it was exported widely across the galaxy. You'll have seen in the last episode that I already created the MG34 in my CAD software. Fortunately, I had a good set of drawings, so this stage, despite being complicated, was fairly straightforward. I didn't have to do too much detective work, and there are a lot of reference photos out there, which did help a lot. My main problem wasn't the MG34, it was the mount. I had very little information on the late StuG MG34 mount, and this was a major problem. The MG34, as fitted to the late StuG 3G, was unusual in that it could not only be fired from outside the fighting compartment, but with the periscope and linkages could be fired from the inside as well. This mount was known as the Rundenfeuer, and was fitted to StuG 3Gs, StuG 4s and Hetzers. Trying to find information on this mount is why this episode took so long to get finished. Eventually, I managed to work out what was going on and came up with a pretty good representation in my CAD software. My next problem was working out how I was going to make it. I decided to make a start by 3D printing as much as possible on my resin printer. Then I could decide what my next move was going to be. I filled the print bed with parts in different orientations, so I had spares just in case of a print failure. Fortunately, everything printed well, so I had spares just in case I screwed something up in the cleaning up stage. I decided to cast all these parts in pewter, as they'd be far too fragile for me just in resin, given the amount of handling they would get throughout the project. I tidied up the prints with some milliput and started to work out a rough plan for assembly, which meant adding a few pegs and beefing up some of the parts. I then went through my usual process of cold cure mould making and casting. You can see more on this process in my how-to series. While the castings may not look pretty at first sight, I'm confident I now have something to work from to get a decent result. These are the castings with the basic feeds and air vents removed. The surface is a bit rough and I'll have to drill out the cooling holes along the barrel, but I now have some solid parts to work with. Now starts the long process of cleaning up everything by hand, reinstating and adding detail. After a few days, this is where I'm at with the base of the mount. The base ring slips neatly onto the main mount and the periscope fits in the centre. After careful cleaning up and adding bolt head detail, I fabricated the side shields from 0.7mm brass sheet. I took this stage very carefully, and the shields fitted really well onto the mount, just located with brass bolts. The shields were then permanently glued in place with superglue, and nuts were added to the inside. You can see that the periscope has a clear view between the two shields, and will be below the barrel of the MG34. The next section mounts onto the base mount and carries the MG34. It's hinged and actuated by two linkages attached to a bracket at the front. I made the bracket from brass strip and used model railway handrail knobs to help recreate the linkages in brass. The locking lever was carved out of an offcut of pewter. And here it is assembled. You can see how it hinges, although it will be fixed on the final model. There is a cable linkage to the trigger mechanism on the right hand side, which I'll add later. The MG34 cleaned up pretty well, after I carefully drilled out the holes in the barrel jacket. I also replaced a couple of details with brass rod. And here they are, the two main sub-assemblies, finally cleaned up and ready for paint. The cradle for the MG34 is now fitted to the base unit, and I've added a brass rod running down beside the periscope to recreate the firing cable to the trigger. You can also see the linkage operating the elevation fits neatly above the periscope. Let's see how these two parts fit together. I reckon that's pretty good. They locate positively and they're straight and square to each other. Fortunately, nothing fouls. I'm really happy with the final result. This small part of the StuG has almost been a project in its own right, and has taken a lot longer than I planned. This was mainly down to researching and planning how I was going to make it all. I now have something accurate and not too fragile. It's going to be a nightmare to paint though, trying to get coverage between those two shields, but that's a problem for another day. Let's see how it looks fitted to the rest of the StuG. It's a small but important part of the build finally out of the way. I must say that small fiddly bits aren't my favourite, and that's why I decided to go for 1/12 scale. The problem is that when you go up in scale, what was small becomes easier, but then you discover a whole new realm of detail. After all this detail work, I feel like tackling some big stuff. I think the next step will be the lower hull. That'll be a big step forward, and then possibly onto the running gear. Maybe even fitting the fighting compartment and engine deck. Then it'll start looking a bit more like a StuG at last. But that will all have to wait till the next episode of Project StuG. I hope you're enjoying Project StuG. If you are, share with your friends and make sure you subscribe to my channel. So you catch my next video when it goes live, click on the bell icon. As you can see from my channel, I always have lots of projects going on, which I hope you'll find interesting. If you have any questions about Project StuG, just leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching.